time has now come for the Gambia to achieve full sovereign independence.
And that I will do right to all manner of people according to the law.
The Jawara administration, the public enemy. Victory for the oppressed people of the Gambia.
The Gambia has now been independent for 10 years, well, for 9 years.
We have seen historically that everyone was resisting.
So there is no reason why we should not continue as an entity, as a separate independent entity.
Tuabi yang don't resist, big enough independence you resist.
We will continue to practice the democratic principles.
So when you grab aku ide, ni kon ñu dem nen bu yaga de. 1982 be 90 minutes doy na dafa génn.
And then suddenly the government brings 60 or so Nigerians. You rent expensive house for them. You gave everybody a car.
The government that brought them into the country had no idea about what they were doing. Arrest him at his garden, because he was there almost every Thursday.
You can shoot and tie in your soldier.
Look at these young people. Very quite interesting.
Before the Gambia became known for coups, dictators and the military drama of the 1990s, it was simply a river, a long stretch of water that European empires fought tooth and nail to control. And this tiny strip of land wrapped around that river, it would eventually become one of the smallest nations in Africa, but with one of the biggest political shake-ups the continent have ever seen. To understand the 1994 coup, you gotta go way back before Jawara, before Jammeh, before independence, because Gambia wasn't built randomly. It was shaped piece by piece by centuries of trade, conflict, and foreign hands fighting over influence. Long before the British or the French came to West Africa, the land around River Gambia was part of an ancient Senegambia region, home to Mandinka kingdoms, Fulani pastoralists, Wolof societies, and Jola communities deep in the forests of the south. And for centuries, the Gambia wasn't a country. It was a corridor, a highway, a link between inland kingdoms and Atlantic traders. But everything changed once Europe entered the chat. First the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then eventually the British. And once the Atlantic slave trade exploded, the Gambia became one of its major arteries. Fort James, now Kunta Kinte Island, turned into a base for capturing, holding, and shipping enslaved Africans through the Atlantic. Tens of thousands passed through here. And the river that once fed empires now fed a global nightmare. The French controlled everything around it, which is modern-day Senegal today, which basically turned Gambia into a thin British island trapped inside another empire. This setup would shape Gambia's politics forever. With a small territory, limited resources, the government relied heavily on Britain to run anything important. By the 1950s, West Africa was changing. Independence movements were popping up everywhere. Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, and in the Gambia, a small but determined group of political activists began pushing for self-rule. And the river that once fueled the slave trade was now fueling a political awakening. And at the center of that political wave was a quiet, soft-spoken veterinary doctor that eventually led the Gambia into independence and ruled it for over 30 years. And his rise to power would set the stage for tensions, frustrations, and cracks in the system that eventually allowed the 1994 coup to happen. Born in 1924 in Barajali, up the river, Jawara grew up in a rural Mandinka family with strong Islamic roots. Nothing about his early life screamed future president. He went to school, studied hard, and unlike most people in the colony, he got the chance to attend university abroad. He trained as a vet in Ghana and Scotland and became one of the most educated Gambians in his generation. When he returned, he wasn't thinking about politics, he was treating cows and livestock for the colonial government. But at the time, being educated in the Gambia automatically made you part of the political conversation, especially for a colony desperate for local leadership. By the late 1950s, Gambian politics was basically a tug-of-war between two groups. The colony elites in Bathurst, now known as Banjul, most urban, educated, and the protectorate majority, the rural population, Mandinka, Fula, Jola, Wolof, who made up the bulk of the country but had almost no political power. Jawara saw this imbalance firsthand, and in 1959 he co-founded the People's Progressive Party, PPP, a party that spoke directly to the rural majority. PPP's whole agenda was simple: the colony can't run the country alone. The protectorate deserves equal voice. This message hit hard and fast. Jawara wasn't a fiery speaker, but he was calm, respected, and trusted. Within a few years, PPP became the dominant force in Gambian politics, the fight for independence. As more African countries gained independence, pressure grew in the Gambia. PPP pushed hard and Jawara forced the British to negotiate a transfer of power. In the elections of 1960, he won a seat in the Gambian legislature and was appointed the Minister of Education in the government. He resigned his ministerial post in 1961 when the British government picked a rival Gambian leader to serve as the Gambian interim Prime Minister, preparatory to the new elections. In 1962, he became the Prime Minister under internal self-government, basically the warm-up phase for full independence. And on February 18, 1965, the Gambia finally became an independent nation.
The time has now come for the Gambia, to achieve full sovereign independence.
The Commonwealth has a vital role to play in a troubled world, and we will apply for membership in the Commonwealth Club. We know too that Britain and the other Commonwealth countries with whom we have historic and special ties will be foremost among the countries which will help us financially. We will continue to practice the democratic principles which you have bequeathed to us and make the Gambia a shining example of democracy and stability.
Preserve and defend the Constitution, and that I will do right to all manner of people according to the law, without fear or favor.
But here's the twist. Jawara didn't want a revolution, no violence, no breakups, no purges. He kept the British-trained civil servants, the British legal system, the British political model. Everything stayed calm. That stability became his biggest strength, and later, his biggest weakness. In 1970, the Gambia became a republic, and Jawara became the first president. He would stay in that role for the next 24 years. Under his leadership, the Gambia became known as Africa's smiling coast, peaceful, stable, and friendly to the West. But the country also stayed extremely small, extremely poor, and extremely dependent on foreign aid. Jawara was loved by many, but he was also accused of relying too much on patronage.
The Gambia has now been independent for 10 years, well, for 9 years. We will celebrate our 10th anniversary of independence in February 1975. We have not made a bad job of things, and there is no reason why we should not continue as an entity. Historically, we have been an entity for centuries. There is no reason why we should not continue as a separate, independent entity.
The elite around him benefited, the rural poor, the army was tiny and underfunded, and corruption quietly grew in the background. Now, for a long time, these cracks didn't break the system, but they were getting wider. And in 1981, the first major sign of trouble hit. Now, there's not much information about Kukoi's background, so I'm gonna keep it really short, but it's very interesting. So basically, he was born in 1953, goes to St. Augustine School, then moves to Senegal, trains to become a Catholic priest, but he gets expelled, comes back frustrated. In 1977, he tries democracy first, runs for parliament under the NCP, he loses badly, and something inside him snaps. He leaves the Gambia, travels, learns revolutionary ideology, ends up in Libya, allegedly connects with Gaddafi, absorbs radical politics, and comes back, not as a politician, but as a revolutionary. So we're back on track. On the 30th of July, 1981, Jawara was in London, attending the royal wedding of Princess Diana and Prince Charles. Celebration and big smiles. Meanwhile, something deadly was already moving back home. Kukoi gathers about 11 men, mostly civilians. Taxi drivers, fishermen, watchmen. This was not a military coup. This was ordinary Gambians picking up guns. They march from Talendin to Bakau, head straight to the Field Force Armory. Gunfire breaks out, and the first casualty falls. Kikala Balde, the armory commander. And from that moment, the Gambia is officially at war with itself. Kukoi's men start moving fast. They take Yundum Airport, they move towards State House, they lock down Banjul, and then they capture the most powerful weapon in the entire country, Radio Gambia, because whoever controls the radio controls the nation. For the first time in Gambian history, the country wakes up not to music, not to news, but to a stranger declaring himself ruler.
Long live the heroic comrades in the field force, raised to the ranks of the People's Liberation Army. Long live the struggle, death to neocolonialism, racism and fascism in the Gambia. Death of capitalism and bold imperialism. Down with the Jawara administration, the public enemy. Victory for the Gambian revolutionary struggle. Victory for the oppressed people of the Gambia. Poor Gambians have not only lost their means of livelihood, but with it, their illusion. The people want guaranteed access to food, housing, clothing, jobs, free medical and health care, better roads and traffic control so as to minimize road accidents. They want prices that are both stable and reasonable. They demand the end of corruption and injustice in high offices, a method they simply use to turn the topsy-turvy. The people need to be freed from the cruel pangs of blood-sucking landlords. They want the state to spend our money on a more diversified, mechanized, and rewarding agriculture. Our poor brothers and sisters legitimately demand the end of poverty, ignorance, disease, corruption, and injustice.
From here, things only get darker. State House taken. The First Lady and Jawara's family held hostage, something Africa had never really seen at that level before. Then Kukoi drags respected Gambians to Radio Gambia, forces them to denounce Jawara live on air, telling him never to return again. Nobody trusted anything anymore. People locked indoors, families hiding, streets empty, and gunshots echoing across Banjul for 8 days. 8 days of fear, chaos, and bloodshed. Over 1,000 Gambians dead. Businesses destroyed. Properties worth over $5 million gone. The smallest nation in mainland Africa brought to its knees. Jawara hears about the coup while in London. He immediately gets word from loyal ministers hiding inside police headquarters. They tell him there is still resistance, but they need help. Jawara doesn't panic. He doesn't flee permanently. He does something bold. He activates the 1965 Defense Pact with Senegal. He calls Dakar, and Senegal answers. And on August 1st, 1981, Senegalese troops land in Banjul. And from that moment, it becomes war. Street fighting, house fighting, hostage situations, gun battles around radio stations. Even Senegalese soldiers died, including 18 troops when a helicopter was shot down near Radio City. This wasn't a protest, this wasn't politics, this was bloodshed. 8 days of chaos. But eventually, Kukoi loses, and he flees to Guinea-Bissau. And the Gambia slowly breathes again. Now here's what shocks people. After all this, Sir Dawda Jawara comes back, and instead of revenge, he chooses law. Over 2,000 people detained, but every single one accounted for. No disappearances, hybrid courts, trials, some freed and some sentenced. No executions. Jawara literally tours the country weeks later to preach unity and explain what happened.
Well, generally things are coming back to normal. Most of the rebels have been taken into custody. There are just a few at large in hiding. As far as the security situation is concerned, things are back to normal, even though we still have the emergency, state of emergency in existence and a curfew. Life really is more or less back to normal.
Weapons were recovered, government restored, even looted property was returned through official commissions, and somehow the country moved forward. But mentally, Gambia had changed forever, because 1981 taught everyone something terrifying. If your state isn't strong enough, anyone with guns, men, and belief can take your country. And that lesson, it never went away. It's exactly the shadow that hangs over everything leading to 1994. So after 8 days of chaos, after over 1,000 lives lost, after the country nearly collapsed completely, Gambia survived. But it didn't come out the same, because one thing was now painfully clear: the Gambia could not defend itself alone. And that reality is what led to one of the most important political decisions in Gambian history: the creation of the Senegambia Confederation in 1982. Now on paper, this looked like unity. Two neighbors, one shared vision, security, stability, cooperation. But in reality, this was a marriage built out of fear. Fear that what happened in 1981 could happen again. Because let's be honest, if Senegal didn't step in, there's a very real chance Kukoi might have held power longer. So from Jawara's perspective, the logic was simple. If we nearly lost the country once, we can't risk that happening again. In his interview with the West Coast Radio, Mr. Baima Stal, who was working with the Gambia's Ministry of Fisheries at the time, explains it further.
Now, when it failed and Sir Dawda became installed as president, and all of a sudden we started talking about confederation. So the rumors, nobody knows this, only Sir Dawda and Abdou Diouf can tell you, even Ibutal doesn't know. When Sir Dawda went to Abdou Diouf, they locked themselves into cabinet. What they talked about, nobody knew.
To this day.
To this day. Some people say, oh, maybe fofu ko hen na la dimbale de way nak dañoo nekk benn. That's the rumor. That's why I say federation or confederation. What we learned is that Senegal wanted federation. Sir Dawda didn't want federation, they comprised a confederation. Mm-hmm. So, bobu wahi cabinet la. Mm-hmm. So when they came now to draw the protocol, you have the Coup declaration. It was not written at Coup. They were in Mansakila Bar, mm-hmm. from Bansang, floating, and Ibu single-handedly was drafting it. He said he put the last full stop at Coup. Last full stop at Coup, and he told them, I'm ready. So they signed it there. That's why it's called the Coup declaration. Mm-hmm. Now, here we have seen historically that everyone was resisting. Tuabi yang don't resist, beginning of independence, you resist, etc.
Aku yang don't resist.
Asik yang go resist. So war nañu gërëm aku yi de. Ni kon ñun dem nañ bu yaaga de. Ñoom dañu wara continuer maa ngi leen lifin dañu wara continuer di play big political role.
Suma doon ubbi pro na ma ne bonjour du ma ne good morning.
Ni kon bonjour la ñoo wax yo leen ni kon fu mu nekk ni kon suutantaay la ñoo sol de.
So under this confederation, Senegal and Gambia agreed to work together on defense, share military coordination, and protect each other from internal threats, which basically meant that Senegal now had a major say in Gambian security. And for a while, it worked. No coups, no uprisings, no chaos. On the surface, everything looked stable. But underneath, problems were building, because this wasn't an equal partnership. Senegal was bigger, stronger, and more powerful. And over time, it started to feel like Gambia was slowly losing control of its own sovereignty. Some Gambians started asking questions. Why are we relying on another country to defend us? Why does Senegal have much influence over our military? And where do we draw the line? And then came the disagreements, political tension, control issues, different visions for how deep this union should go. Senegal wanted more integration, but Gambia, not so much. And by 1989, the whole thing collapsed, just like that. The confederation was over. Senegal pulled back, and suddenly Gambia was alone again. No external protection, no military backup, and no safety net. Just a country that had already seen how quickly things could fall apart, now forced to stand on its own.
1982 ba 90 minutes doy na dafa génn bu bi den génn boobu nag naxari na Abdou Diouf torop parce que ñoom ba ñoo ñëw fii seen soldat bari deneen fi de parce que ñu doon xeel duñ soldat gars yi daan wàcc ak heli ak parachute
du woon conventional warfare.
du woon conventional gars yi ne leen gi so boobu naxari na ko moom tam dafa naaw rek within 24 hours génne nitam yëpp State House génne leen fa sëy bu tas tës bu ñaaw la.
This is where the next phase of the story begins, because now the Gambia needs to build its own military. And the people who would later take power in 1994 are already watching, already learning, and already inside the system. Because once Senegal stepped back, another country quietly stepped in. And this time, they didn't just protect the system, they helped create the men who would eventually challenge it. So now, the Senegambia Confederation is gone, Senegal has stepped back, the safety net is removed, and for the first time since 1981, the Gambia is fully responsible for its own security. And that's a problem, because at this point, the Gambia doesn't really have a proper army. What it had before was the field force, basically a paramilitary police unit, not built for war, not built for defense, and definitely not built to stop another coup. So the government makes a decision that would unknowingly change the country forever. They create a real army, the Gambia National Army. Now here's where things start getting interesting, because building an army from scratch is not easy. You need structure, you need a discipline, and you need training. And Gambia did not have that internally. So they turned to Nigeria, a country with one of the most experienced militaries in West Africa, and Nigeria sends in trainers, officers, commanders, military advisors. This program becomes known as the Nigerian Training Assistance Group. Young Gambian soldiers are now being trained properly, learning tactics, weapons handling, and command structures. For the first time, this is starting to look like a real military. But to really understand what this period was like, we need to fast forward for a second. Years later, after Yahya Jammeh's rule came to an end, the Gambia set up something called the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, also known as the TRRC. This was a national investigation where victims, soldiers, and former officials came forward to testify under oath about what really happened during that era. And for the first time, the public got to hear directly from people who were there, what they saw, what they experienced, and what was really going on behind the scenes. And when it comes to the 1990s military, some of the most important insights come from testimonies given by the soldiers that served in that era. And according to the testimony presented at the TRRC, the period wasn't as smooth as it looked, because alongside training came tension.
They come in, as we are told, coming to train us, and that was the exact name they had, Nigerian Army Training Assistance Group. So why would they be occupying the positions where the Gambians should have been? So for us, first interpretation is that the government that brought them into the country had no idea about what they were doing, or they have no respect for the military.
Some others giving testimony even go further to suggest that there was mistreatment, humiliation, and a serious lack of respect for Gambian soldiers.
Yes, there were other problems that also affected the GNA. Because before, you had to understand that some of our officers in the Gambian National Army, not the Gendarmerie yet, they, as you know, it's a democracy. The government has limited resources at the time. They have finite resources. So there was a problem. Some of them, you know, the housing and other issues. And then suddenly the government brings 60 or so Nigerians. You rent expensive house for them. You gave everybody a car. You know, the trouble is starting, because then the guys at Yundum barracks, then you saw the soldiers begging for leave and so on. I think that was an oversight. So you start to see the moral problem.
And this is where the frustration starts building. Not loudly or publicly, but inside the barracks. Because now you've got young men, trained, disciplined, and armed, but also undervalued, underpaid, and increasingly aware of their own power. And within that environment, a small group of soldiers begin to stand out. Now at this point, these are not powerful men, no political positions, no national influence, just young officers inside a growing army, but history would remember them differently. A few months before the coup in July 1994, the atmosphere inside the Gambian military became toxic. Frustration everywhere, young officers whispering in corners, and among those young officers, this is where the masterminds of the coup d'etat come in place. So this was initially a small circle of young soldiers, including Lieutenant Yahya Jammeh. He was observant, always calculating and always watching. By 1994, Jammeh held the rank of lieutenant inside the Gambian National Army, slightly senior to several of the younger officers around him. Then there is Second Lieutenant Sanna Sabally, aggressive, energetic, and fearless. Where Jammeh appeared calm, Sanna Sabally was fiery, often pushed situations forward when others hesitated. Inside the coup story himself, Sanna would become one of the most important tactical figures on the ground, because when things started going wrong, he refused to back down, and he later became the mastermind of the whole coup itself. Then comes Second Lieutenant Singhateh, strategic, confident, and highly influential within the group. And later during the TRRC hearings, Singhateh would become one of the most important witnesses explaining how the coup unfolded internally. But back in 1994, he was simply another frustrated young officer inside the growing conspiracy. And then Second Lieutenant Saidabu Haidara, often described as calmer and more measured than some of the others. Not as explosive as Sabally, not as mysterious as Jammeh, still deeply involved in the inner circle. Haidara was considered intelligent, disciplined, and politically aware. He was trusted. And finally, Second Lieutenant Yankuba Toure, another crucial member of the group. Like the others, Toure came out of the same environment: poor military conditions, frustration inside the barracks, and growing anger toward leadership. Now, what makes this story crazy was how these young men actually were. These were not senior generals. with decades of power. These were young officers, mostly in their 20s, and yet within the army, they already started convincing themselves of something dangerous, that the government was weak and that they were capable of taking control themselves. And then by mid-1994, the conversations inside the barracks were no longer hypothetical. The idea of a coup was becoming real. So this is where they started planning. At first, some discussions reportedly focused on confronting the Nigerian commanders. But the deeper the plotters went into planning, the more they realized something. Once you move against a military command, you're already committing treason. So the objective escalates. This stops being about commanders. Now they're talking about removing the Jawara government itself. And once that decision is made, there's no turning back. The initial plan was to try and apprehend Jawara in his garden, where he is usually every Thursday. But having analyzed everything, they realized that this is probably going to cause a lot of casualties, because the president was always with his presidential guard, and there were civilians involved, and there were women in the garden helping him. So they ruled out that option. So another option was to hit the government at the airport, because on the 21st of July 1994, President Dawda Jawara was returning to the Gambia from an overseas trip. And according to later testimonies, the conspirators believed the airport would be the perfect place to move quickly before the government fully reacted and avoid any casualties.
And in this direction, we had many times tried to see if we can arrest him at his garden, because he was there almost every Thursday. But we realized if we had to embark on that, that would be a lot of loss of lives, especially on the side of the PG. This is the presidential guard bodies, and also the women civilians who were always with him at the garden. And we looked for another option. And this come in, he was coming on the 21st at the airport. So we thought this is the chance.
Yahya Jammeh and Edward Singhateh's role was to apprehend Jawara at the airport when he comes back from his trip. And Sanna Sabally's role was to make sure he blocks the airport gate, making sure no one goes in and no one goes out until he gets word that President Jawara has been apprehended. Simple, fast and direct, or at least in theory. But before the operation could properly unfold, something goes wrong. The word leaks. Security forces started sensing that something unusual is happening among junior officers. Security moves in and there's tension everywhere. And in the middle of it all, Yahya Jammeh and Edward Singhateh reportedly get confronted and disarmed completely. And suddenly the airport operation begins collapsing in real time.
Not only had it leaked and that we were searched before we went on parade, Jammeh was disarmed. Sanna Sabally was supposed to bring ammunition to the airport because we didn't have any ammunition, and upon his arrival and distribution of the ammunition, which should have coincided with the plane parking at the on the apron, then we would have launched. But because we did not have the tools to implement, we could not. That is why it failed.
But apparently no one was arrested, even with the suspicion of a coup happening at that time. Because instead of immediately neutralizing the plotters, there was hesitation, and that gave Sanna Sabally the opening he needed. Because after the airport situation falls apart, military command reportedly orders Sanna Sabally away from the center of operations with instructions linked to deployment toward Farafenni.
He said, make sure that the last ferry doesn't leave you behind. I will call the commandant and make sure that you are in Farafenni. I said, yes, sir. So for them, I will go because I said, yes, sir. I turned.
Did you have any plans of going back?
No, never.
By now, Sanna Sabally was fully committed. Backing out is no option at all. Because from his perspective, if the plot had already been exposed, arrest is probably coming anyway. So instead of retreating, Sanna Sabally escalates. He moves toward the armory. He secures the weapons for the mutineers, arming all the loyal junior soldiers inside the barracks. At that point, this stops being a secret plotting. It's now an armed rebellion. Then Sabally contacted Jammeh and Singhateh. The same men who had just been disarmed hours earlier are miraculously not arrested. And the message Sabally told Jammeh and Singhateh is, it's too late to turn back now. He tells them they have the weapons, they have the men, and by morning, command would likely arrest all of them anyway.
So that's the time I took those weapons to another location again. And I was there up to 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the night. I armed all those weapons. I called Jammeh. I said, you have to come to the camp immediately. We cannot let this happen because we're going to be arrested. And then he said, how do I come in? I said, you command a taxi, pay the taxi, come to the barracks. But on your way to the barracks, collect Edward Singhateh, who was in opposite the Kairaba police at the time, and then come to the Pokunda, collect Sadibu, and come to the camp.
And that night, they regroup at the Yundum barracks. By this stage, they are fully prepared to move to Banjul itself. But then the morning comes and then everything starts going wrong again. The military vehicles inside the barracks had already been fuel drained. Keys were removed and transport was all of a sudden crippled. Loyal officers had already tried sabotaging the operation. The mutineers suddenly can't even move their convoy toward Banjul. Again, the coup looks seconds away from collapsing, but then Sabally refuses to stop. The soldiers abandon the military vehicles completely and move out toward the highway. This is where the whole thing starts looking less like a planned military operation and more like controlled chaos. Armed soldiers begin intercepting civilian and government vehicles directly off the road. Drivers were being forced out, cars were being seized on the spot to build a makeshift convoy. This was messy, desperate and improvised. But somehow it works. And now the mutineers are finally moving toward Banjul, toward State House, toward the point of no return.
When we had been satisfied that all of the troops had been armed, we divided them into 3 groups. One group to go to State House, one group to go to Fajara Barracks, and the other group to remain at Yundum and provide reinforcements as and when necessary.
At this point, the mutineers were fully committed. There was no turning back anymore. The airport operation had already failed. The conspiracy had been exposed. Weapons were already distributed inside Yundum barracks, and now the objective becomes simple: take control of the country before the loyalists can reorganize. So the coup plotters split into 2 groups, one led by Sanna Sabally and Sadibu Haidara, and the other one led by Yahya Jammeh and Edward Singhateh. But before they head for Banjul, inside the barracks, officers who were not part of the coup or unwilling to support it were detained, neutralized, before they could organize resistance. Then Sabally moves towards one of the most important targets of the entire operation: cable and wireless. Sabally ensured that the communication lines were completely cut, disrupting the government's ability to coordinate a response. Phones were disrupted and information slowed down and confusion spreading. Meanwhile, the second convoy, led by Edward Singhateh and Yahya Jammeh, was moving fast toward Banjul. But along the Banjul highway, things almost turned violent again. Near Bond Street, members of the Gendarmerie, which is the paramilitary police force, confront the convoy, and according to later testimony, one of the officers there was Ibrahim Chongan. The tension immediately explodes when Chongan reportedly fired shots toward the convoy.
And I explained to them, now we have to resist. Then we were there. Just moments later, we saw the soldiers coming, and to my horror, I saw our own tactical support group have torn their berets. In other words, they have joined the soldiers, the mutiny. And I said, all right, even if I have to die, I will die. So I decided to open fire and fired a couple of bursts of gunfire. Well, because I was with all of my unit and nobody fired. So I realized that, the next step, I'm committing suicide, I will die.
And suddenly, Chongan realizes the danger immediately. If he keeps firing alone, he could die right there. So instead of turning the Bond Street into a full-gun battle, he backs off, and the convoy keeps moving toward Banjul. The next major confrontation and negotiation took place at the door of State House itself, because the State House is completely guarded by the Presidential Guard. And this was the final obstacle, because if the guards could resist properly, Banjul would become a battlefield. The mutineers arrive with their weapons ready, but they try something else immediately: persuasion, especially around one issue: conditions. Low salaries, poor treatment, disrespect towards soldiers, the exact same frustrations that had pushed the mutineers toward rebellion in the first place. They communicate to the presidential guards directly, telling them you're suffering too, and why die defending politicians while soldiers are treated like this. And incredibly, it works. The guards lower their weapons, some join the coup, others stand outside, but either way,
they are called the PG, the presidential guards. They are not better off as the Gambian National Army soldiers. In fact, we are worst in terms of conditions. And I believe they understood, thank God. Then they lay down their arms and I addressed them that we are one, we are all fighting for the same thing. We are not going to separate our institutions from the TSG or the army. We are one. And then we gave them back their weapons right there. And we became one.
State House falls. The government of Sir Dawda Jawara collapses. A group of junior soldiers in their 20s had just taken over the country.
Certainly, look at these young people. Very quite interesting. Your Excellency. Let's keep. In your office, Toko Jatabanyum from Felenta Duntanang, Menketa Lieutenant Yahya Jammeh, and in Captain Soare Felenti be Diamukan, Nalo be Koyin Diamukan, Koyin Tanyaming, Ibo Loko Fangamira, Alaten Dubalo Yinti, Lieutenant Singhateh Felenti, Abekoma, Lieutenant Sabally, Captain Kambi, Lieutenant Yankuba Ture Felenti, Kambi Felenti, Lieutenant Sabally, Enimbara Baki.
Animbara lado kunyima
Yatamo ketanyadi.
Tamo alhamdulillah kadundara kaira nara kaira.
Jawara was eventually evacuated from the country, with assistance linked to foreign naval protection in the region, avoiding direct capture by the mutineers. And just like that, the man who had ruled the Gambia since independence was suddenly in exile. No final battle, no dramatic last stand, just a government that had collapsed faster than anybody expected. And from that moment onwards, the country belonged to AFPRC. And this is where Sanna Sabally and Sadibu Haidara make it to State House to join the others. They immediately formed a council, and Lieutenant Yahya Jammeh, who was the most senior at the time, became the chairman of the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council, otherwise known as AFPRC. And then Sanna Sabally was given the role of vice chairman, Edward Singhateh takes the Minister of Defense, Sadibu Haidara becomes the Interior Minister, and Yankuba Ture, who later joined them at State House, became the Local Government and Lands Minister. Then came the radio announcements about the successful overthrow of the government, and just like that, the Gambia had begun a new era. And as the smoke settled over Banjul, few Gambians could have imagined what was coming next, because the quiet lieutenant named Yahya Jammeh will go on to rule the Gambia for the next 22 years. A presidency that would later become surrounded by allegations of torture, killings, disappearances, death squads, and some of the darkest chapters in Gambian history. And this was only the beginning, because the deeper you go into the Jammeh era, the darker the story gets. And we're going to unpack all of it.